As the selectees are called forward, those of you who are pinning the anchors and placing the cover should also come forward to join them on the stage. We ask that you please hold your applause until all selectees have been pinned, regrouped, and formally introduced collectively as chiefs. Chief selectees, Alvarez, Beverly, Burton, and Carbonell, front and center. Chief Select Alvarez will have his anchors pinned on by his wife Jira and his sister Jenny. He will have his cover presented by Chief Beckerman. Chief Select Beverly will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Iriano and Chief Rosales. He will have his cover presented by Senior Chief Lee. Chief Select Burton will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Cerote and Senior Chief Juarez. He will have his cover presented by Chief Goulon. Chief Select Carbonell will have his anchors pinned on by Command Master Chief Horton and his wife Michelle. He will have his cover presented by Chief Cruz Batala. First rank, post. Chief Alvarez, arriving. Chief Beverly, arriving. Chief Burton, arriving. Chief Carbonell, arriving.
Chief selectees, Carretero, Chong Medina, Capillac, and Darnell, front and center. Chief Select Carretero will have his anchors pinned on by his wife, Mami, and his sons, Kinshin and Ryusei, along with Chief Oliva and Senior Chief Tanhuakio. He will have his cover presented by Chief Trammell. Chief Select Chong Medina will have his anchors pinned on by his wife, Satomi, and children, Miki and Yuki. He will have his cover presented by Senior Chief Mac James. Chief Capillac will have his anchors pinned on by his wife Michelle and his daughter Stacey. He will have his cover presented by Chief Keese. Chief Select Darnell will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Suzinski and Chief Fritz. He will have his cover presented by Senior Chief Mac James. First rank, post. Chief Carretero, arriving. Chief Chong Medina, arriving. Chief Kapiak, arriving. Chief Darnell, arriving.
Chief selectees Figueroa, Hanson, Heathcote, and Urick, front and center. Chief Select Figueroa will have his anchors pinned on by Senior Chief Alonzo and Chief Steele, who will have his cover presented by Chief Steele. Chief Select Hanson will have her anchors pinned on by her son Michael. She will have her cover presented by Chief Hankersley. Chief Select Heathcote will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Taylor and Lieutenant DeWolf. He will have his cover presented by Chief Alonzo. Chief Select Hurix will have his anchors pinned on by his wife Faye and his daughter Amina. He will have his cover presented by Chief Perea. First ring, post. Chief Figueroa, arriving. Chief Hanson, arriving. Chief Heathcote, arriving. Chief Hurix, arriving.
Chief selectees Joseph, Kazel, Lee, and Lopez, front and center. Chief Select Joseph will have his anchors pinned on by Senior Chief Meyer and Master Chief James. He will have his cover presented by Chief Bolliard. Chief Select Kazel will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Taylor and Chief Nelson. He will have his cover presented by Chief Alvarez.
Lopez.
Chief Select Lee will have his anchors pinned on by his wife, Raynalyn, and children Divine, Bambao, and Devin. He will have his cover presented by Senior Chief Badua. Chief Select Lopez will have his anchors pinned on by his wife, Narapan. He will have his cover presented by Chief Mansonow. First ring, post. Chief Joseph, arriving. Chief Hazel, arriving. Chief Lee, arriving. Chief Lopez, arriving.
Chief selectees, Odle, Carr, Phillips, and Ponce, front and center. Chief Select Odle will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Hernandez and Senior Chief Carlson. He will have his cover presented by Senior Chief Wilkerson. Chief Select Parr will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Nicholas and Chief Hughes Batala. He will have his cover presented by Senior Chief Castro. Chief Select Phillips will have his anchors pinned on by his wife Monica and his son Jaden. He will have his cover presented by Chief Forwood. Chief Select Ponce will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Steele and his wife Andrea, his daughters Abigail and Marissa. He will have his cover presented by Chief McDonald. First ring, post.
Susan.
Chief Odle, arriving. Chief Parr, arriving. Chief Phillips, arriving. Chief Ponce, arriving.
Chief selectees, Quintano, Ramirez, and Ryhall. Front and center.
I did?
Chief Select Quintano will have his anchors pinned on by his wife Patricia, son Jeremiah, and Chief Iriano. He will have his cover presented by Chief Brown. Chief Select Ramirez will have his anchors presented by his wife Coral, daughter Addie, and son Alexander. He will have his cover presented by Senior Chief Goodspeed. Chief Select Ryhall will have his anchors pinned on by Senior Chief Sanderson and his wife Casey. He will have his cover presented by Chief Hendra. First ring, post. Chief Quintano, arriving. Chief Ramirez, arriving.
Smile, Gunny.
Chief Ryhall, arriving.
Chief selectees Colbert, Torres, and Walker, front and center. Chief Select Tolbert will have his anchors pinned on by Chief Cunningham and Senior Chief Johnson. He will have his cover presented by Master Chief James. Chief Select Torres will have his anchors presented by his wife Carolina and Senior Chief Trial. He will have his cover presented by Senior Chief McKernan. Chief Select Walker will have his anchors pinned on by his wife Yvette, son Travis, and daughter Tanea. He will have his cover presented by Chief Harrison. First rank, post.
I gotta be right here. Sorry, guys.
Chief Tolbert, arriving. Chief Torres, arriving. Chief Walker, arriving. Johnson, post with the side board.
Left, right. Thanks.